So this is the fourth and final Sunday of our Resurrection Story series. Each week, I've been taking a canonical Gospels stories from Easter morning on. And I started with John's understanding of resurrection. Then the week after that, I moved to Luke. Then Matthew was the last one that we did. Michael filled in last week while we were out of town. And this morning will be Mark's take. I saved the best for last. And I really do mean that. This gospel ending is profound and powerful and not what we expect, because we're used to what the other three have done with this concept. Mark was the first narrative gospel written that we know about. Mark writes his material around 70 CE, roughly. That's at least 3.5 to 4 decades from when Jesus of Nazareth walked the earth. Paul, who writes, of course, before Mark, Paul talks a little about the disciples being seen by Jesus, and Paul gives a really small list of people who experienced the risen Christ. The Gospel of Thomas and our constructed Q Gospel were floating around during this time as well, but those are not narrative-based. What I mean by that is Mark is the first one who puts the Jesus material in a story so that we could remember it. It's a genius move that he does. And the other gospel authors either copy him or create other narrative gospels. So as we get to Mark's ending here in a second, I would like us to pay attention to what's there and what's not. Just imagine if this was the only story we had of the resurrection. Mark 16. After the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, they went and bought spices to anoint his body. And on the first day of the week, when dawn had broken, the women traveled to the tomb. On the way to the tomb, they discussed among themselves, who's going to roll away this stone? But when they got to the tomb, they found out the stone had already been rolled back. So they went inside. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting there. And they were alarmed. But the young man said, "Do not be afraid. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He's not here. He's been raised. This is the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he said you would." So terror and amazement filled the women, and they left the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. That's it. That's how the very first narrative gospel ends. There's no special effects. There's no earthquakes. There's not even any angels present. There's a guy dressed in white. But in Mark's gospel, it's not an angel. He's just a dude in the tomb hanging out. It's slightly to moderately bizarre, I'll tell you that much. Think about the implications of this ending. And then the women left the tomb and didn't say anything to anyone. Now, I've preached on this concept several times on Easter, so it's nothing really new for us to hear. But I don't know that I ever really get a chance to unpack why Mark ends his narrative in this way. So I think that this Sunday might be a good time to do exactly that. Here's my disclaimer. If you are following along in your Bibles, you will see that there are 12 more verses that consist of Mark 16, 9 through 20. Look closely at any Bible you pick up. I don't care what version it is. You pick up that Bible, you will see that there is a footnote. Every single Bible out there has footnotes that says that the earliest manuscripts do not contain verses 9 through 20. Someone or a group of people added material to Mark's ending because it was too disturbing to end it in the way that we saw this morning. We don't see Jesus at all. We don't see any special effects. We don't see any appearances on the road or in the breaking of the bread. And the women stayed silent because they were afraid. Why would the very first person to tell this story in this way choose to end it in this way? Let's start with the fact that we don't even see Jesus in this ending. It's just an empty tomb. And as we're thinking about that question, I'm going to ask a related question. Why is the book always better than the movie? The first books that I really got interested in were the Chronicles of Narnia. And there has been countless cartoons and movie adaptations made about C.S. Lewis's wonderful masterpiece and the world that he created there. None of them compare to the images I see in my head. Harry Potter. I love the Harry Potter movies, but the books are simply better. Game of Thrones, Hunger Games, Lord of the Rings, or any movie based on John Grisham books. Those movies are really good, but the books are better. Mark is not wanting to pigeonhole what resurrection looks like, because once you articulate it, it loses something in the translation. Matthew and Luke and John have all shown us images and pictures of the concept of resurrection. But once you name it and describe it, even if you have the greatest intentions, you have reduced it. It's unavoidable. When you take a concept like resurrection and put images to it, something is lost. But Mark figured this out. And Mark said, I'm not going to be defining what the resurrection of God looks like, or the resurrection according to God. Because resurrection is of God and from God, and I'm going to let it stand on its own. The empty tomb in Mark highlights that God won, Rome lost, death is not the last word, and the way of Jesus leads to life even when death has been activated. That's one of the reasons that I love Mark's ending. He refuses to let imagery get in our way of understanding resurrection. But another reason why I love the ending here is what Mark did with the women at the tomb. It's such a disturbing ending because it's so abrupt, and the good news is not shared because the women were afraid. But Mark wants to elicit that response from the reader, really the hearer, because they heard the gospel. In the ancient world, people were not literate, and so they listened to the gospel stories. One of the reasons that I chose to do it in this way. Mark's gospel, the whole gospel of Mark, takes a little over an hour to perform. I've actually been to a performance of Mark's gospel. It's fascinating. But it's a little over an hour to perform Mark's gospel. The audience back then had a much longer attention span than we do today. But through the performance of the storyteller in worship settings, the audience would travel with Jesus as he was baptized and gathered followers and taught and healed. And he entered the city on Palm Sunday, was betrayed and handed over, crucified, died, and was buried. And then after that emotional journey that the audience has gone through, they received some really shocking news. He's been raised, and the tomb is empty. And the women said nothing. The audience should be outraged. I can't believe they didn't tell anyone. I wouldn't do something like that. If it were me, I'd tell everyone that I knew. And that is what Mark is going for the whole time. He set this thing up for 16 chapters. He brought the audience in with his fast-paced movements during the first part of his gospel. Then he slowed down the agony of Holy Week. The audience was so fully vested in this life-giving story as we approach the end. The silence of the women gave an opportunity for Mark, or the author of Mark, to actually communicate to all audiences during these last 2,000 years. It's almost as if Mark implicitly breaks the fourth wall and addresses his audience right there. The disciples all fell away from him. The authorities killed him. And when there was an empty tomb, the faithful women, even they stayed silent Now what will you do? I mean, that's what the author of Mark is asking the hearer or the reader. It is such a genius rhetorical device and a beautiful way to end this story. And that is why it's my favorite. I don't dislike the other endings. I really don't. But resurrection is the most powerful concept that we have in this movement. And Mark's ending gives it the power it deserves by not defining it and letting God do God's thing. So we started this journey with John's idea of resurrection. In John's gospel, we saw Jesus as the gardener comforting Mary. We saw Jesus not chastising Thomas, but welcoming him and loving him. We saw breakfast on the beach with Peter, with Jesus restoring Peter to community and forgiving him through a meal. The resurrected Christ's compassion was seen in so many different encounters in John's gospel. The week after that, we explored Luke and how his gospel was actually the very last gospel written. And Luke tried to make Jesus as physical as possible. Luke's motivation seemed to be that this really happened, and I really want you to believe it. We saw Jesus appear to the disciples in rooms, at a meal, and on the road to Emmaus. And the week later, we got into Matthew's understanding. Matthew's resurrected Jesus focused on telling people to tell others about this movement. The world is a broken place, according to Matthew. So let's bring the good news of love and mercy and compassion to this world. It's where we get the Great Commission and God's desire that all people come to know this abundant life. And today, we saw what little Mark was willing to show us. And by using the less is more approach, he did not limit the power of resurrection and motivated us to continue the story. I hope you've enjoyed this series of hearing resurrection stories. Some of you have enjoyed it because you have told me so. Some of you have not because you've told me so. We'll get back to some normalcy next week, I promise. But I have enjoyed this journey of staying with each gospel and letting each gospel speak with their voice in this conversation. Because that's what this really is. It's a conversation or a debate or a lively discussion about what resurrection means, the concept. The Bible does not have one voice on anything, by the way, especially resurrection. We are the continuation of these stories. Do you see how playing around with these concepts leads to a deeper exploration of faith and our purpose and how we can co-create with God? Easter is not a movie where we sit back and binge watch 4 different versions of what it means. Easter is something we live. These resurrection stories are not meant to entertain or even to be the ultimate authority on the concept. Easter is participatory. But in each one of those stories, it is stated, he's not here, he's been raised. Thanks be to God. Amen.